All right, I think we're live. Let me double check. Make sure everything's streaming correctly. Okay, it is working. All right, I'm doing this. So today we're going through a deal that my partners and I bought back in May, and you can kind of see how we analyze this deal. So today what I'm going to go through is one, how we analyze the deal at a high level, just because some of the numbers have changed. And then afterwards, we're going to go through the scenarios, the letter of intent that I sent to the seller, so you can kind of see how we present it to the seller. And then I'll show you guys like the promissory note that we use to secure the seller financing for this property. So this is a property in Fairfield, Alabama, which is just outside of Birmingham, Alabama. And when this property first came upon us, I think this home was owned free and clear at that point in time. So from that perspective, we were like, okay, the seller is looking for a specific number, but this way, when we presented the seller financing term, the seller can get the number that they were looking for, but we just needed terms to make sure that it worked for us. So when we first looked up this property on 521 62nd Street, you can see right now that it says 1,020 here for the market rent. So what do we typically do, right? Every single time, whenever we look up the HUD FMR, and this was back in 2023 numbers. So these numbers are probably going to be a little bit different, but let me show you and run through the same process that we typically go through. When you go to HUD FMR, you click to small area FMRs, look up FY 2024, and you can get the county right on Redfin County. And this is in Jefferson County. Okay, Jefferson County. That's how we click on it. And this is in 35064. You can kind of see that the fair market rents at that point in time for a 3-bedroom was $1,360. When we analyzed this deal, let's see what the FMRs were back then. The FMR is 1150. So you can see that the fair market rent has gone up from 2023 numbers of 1150 to 1360. Pretty significant jump in terms of fair market rents, but that's a pretty good deal for us as investors. All right. Now, for the analysis of the property, what we're looking for is one, we had the asking price, and I also got a bid from the contractor that allowed us to figure out what type of renovations was needed. And this was kind of scope. One was we need to build a 90-degree ramp at the front door. We had to repaint some of the living and dining room area, to repair some of the peeling paint, cabinetry, very small handyman stuff. But all in all, we had a quote of $8,466, of which $5,300 was for the wheelchair ramp that we had to build to make the quality of life better for our resident. So I knew that our renovation was 8,466, but I doubled it, to be quite honest with you, so that I was underwriting, assuming that there were going to be things that we did not know about that might need to repair, or we were just setting aside additional reserves. So when I went out and did the numbers, I, just like I always do, I get the FMRs, which we just grabbed from the HUD website, which is right here, 1150 and 1250. And then I went on to affordablehousing.com. At that point in time, when I bought this property, the market rent here was $936 for 25 units within a 0.95 mile radius. So I was underwriting, to be conservative, at a $925 monthly income rate, knowing that I can possibly get higher rents here. But I did not want to be super aggressive because it was a new market at that point in time, and I did not know. I still went through my same items. I got the property taxes. I got the insurance numbers as I continually got quotes, and I updated. Normally, you could also get these numbers from right within the Redfin estimates if it's an on-market property. So what I have is I was underwriting at 10% property management and 4% vacancy. Cool. All right. Next thing I did was I played around with the numbers. And let's see if I can show this. And if you guys are watching on Instagram, you guys can see the full screen version on YouTube. And what I would like to do is show you just exactly how many scenarios I went through in order to get this. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I probably went through about 20 different scenarios, which is similar to what we've been doing for the past 50 days, right? We've been going through, hey, at what point, at what interest, at what down payment can I make this a deal for me? So I wanted my worst case scenario in this scenario to be a 10% cash on cash return. And that allowed me to come up with different scenarios that said, hey, worst case scenario, if I get only $925 for rent, will this still be a deal for me? Even though I'm trying to hit 17% cash on cash return, what if I only get my worst case scenario? And that's usually been one of my other partners' investment appetite to think about whether or not we can offer specific terms that still gets the seller the price that they're looking for, but we'll still get the cash and cash that we're looking for. So when I underwrote all these properties, long story short, I came across a couple of scenarios that I said, hey, these scenarios would probably work for us. One was offering a purchase price of 71 grand, another was 80 grand and 76.5. Okay. Now this is how we presented the offer to the seller. Let's see if I can pull this guy up right here. As I went through the scenario, I kind of just noted all these numbers down here, and then I put it into a worksheet. And this is what the LOI looks like. Let's see, I can make sure I fit this into. Let's see if I can fit this into the screen on Instagram, just because not everybody can see the whole thing. So this is how I organized the thing. I gave the seller 3 different options of what I can potentially offer, which is different purchase prices, different down payment options. Let's see, I can scoot this over a little bit more. What the seller finance amount would be, what the interest might look like, and ultimately a 10-year balloon. A balloon means that even though I'm amortizing the seller finance note over 30 years, I agreed to pay off the seller at the end of 10 years. And if you understand how the amortization schedule typically works, you will know that the interest is actually front loaded. So even though that the purchase price is 71 grand, the seller would likely be walking away with a lot more money if they took this deal. So let's just take a look at this, right? Let me see if I can pull back up the sheet so you guys can kind of quickly see how much interest the seller is making. So at 2.5% interest rate, which is what the seller financing note is going to be. Let's see if I can pull up the total interest paid in the first 10 years, which is going to be 120 months. Okay. If you see that this number, I added up all the interest expenses for the first 10 years, roughly, for the first 120 payments, the seller is getting $13,000, roughly 13.2, 13.3K of interest expenses. You add 13.2 to this 45 grand. So let's just use super easy numbers here so you guys can kind of follow. The seller will be walking away from, let's just do $45,000 plus $13,000 in interest, plus the $10,650 of down payment that the seller would be receiving. This is how much the seller would be. 1 second. Did I miss the number? 1 second. 10,650 plus 45,000 plus another 13,264. Yeah, the seller would be walking away with 68 grand. The point is the seller will get more interest in the first 10 years of the loan so that the seller can come out on top, quote unquote. So they're not just getting necessarily what I'm paying them, but they're also getting the principal and the interest. So in all totality, plus the principal that we pay down over the couple of years, there's another 15 grand. So 68 plus another 15 grand. The seller is actually walking away with 83.964. So if you add up the principal and the interest, this is how you kind of figure out the total what the seller walks away from. So it's 28 grand plus the balloon right here, 45 plus the 10.6 that the seller is getting for a down payment. So you can see why this is more attractive to a seller, because not only are they getting 71 grand, they're walking away with 83 grand for the property after 10 years. So that's one reason why a seller would sell to you on seller finance. So as you kind of go through these terms and present this to the seller gets to decide what purchase price or what option do I want to pick that's most advantageous for me as a seller for this deal. And we had all these things where like, hey, this is the title, like this is what a potential servicing statement that you'll get every single month, so that one, I am automatically direct depositing the payment for this deal every single month, and it goes to your bank account so you don't have to chase me. We also have a promissory note that's kind of set up. So let me see, I can show you guys the promissory note so you guys can see how it looks. So I'll show you guys here. So this is the HUD statement. So you can kind of see, like, one, here's the sales price, here's all the closing costs. And you can kind of see that seller finance mortgage right here, $60,350. That's a number that you will see on a HUD statement for what it actually looks like when you have a seller finance note for the property. Okay. Now, then I'm going to pull up this promissory note. So this promissory note is how you can see, hey, you can see that this is what a seller finance agreement looks like. This is a promissory note that also has a deed in lieu, which means that if for some reason I do not make the payments on the property, the seller gets to take back over the deed automatically if I miss any payments. So this way, the seller doesn't feel like they have to act like a bank and foreclose on me just because I'm not paying any payments. This is how we put into a legal document as a protection for the seller. So the seller says, hey, if you don't make any payments or you get abducted by aliens, I can just take back over the property with any renovations that you have done to date, and I get to keep the down payment. And if the tenant is already in there and is cash flowing, then I just take it back over from that perspective. So this is how it looks like from a HUD perspective. This is the closing statement. And most importantly, what I want you guys to see was just how does a seller finance note, promissory note, look like on an actual closing statement for the property. And this is now what the numbers currently look like. So when I first underwrote it at 950, that's perfectly fine. But I also knew that, hey, after a while, when I did the renovations, my renovation turned out to be significantly less, where I only spent about $6,000 on the renovations, and the original estimate was about $84.66. So that was in my favor, but I was honestly overestimating my rehab, and that's okay. But here's the problem. When I took over the property and we put in renovations, because the housing authority is so far backed up from what they were doing with the sheer volume of work and the residents they were supporting, I did not get my rental increase approved for the property until recently. This was just a couple of weeks ago. So for the longest time, these were my numbers. I only got $700 of rent for the property because that's what the existing rental agreement was in place with the tenant. Even though I have done a rehab, we do not get the rental increase right away for the property. You have to make sure that you get an inspector in there to get the property recertified so that it's approved and meets the housing quality standards that the housing authority has determined that's appropriate for your home. So for the longest time, I was only able to get $600 rent. After property management, principal and interest, taxes, insurance, and setting aside 10% of my rent every single month for maintenance, out netting about $139 a month. But I just got our rental increase, and I'll show you guys what this looks like. So this was an email from, let's see, I can shrink this. This was an email from the housing authority, and it says, hey, good afternoon. The maximum amount of rent if the property is $1,100. If you guys are in agreement, then I can have a process go into effect December 1st. So the tenant portion of the rent will increase to $236. So even though the rent is $1,100, this does not mean a resident has to pay the whole $1,100. Hence the subsidy from your public housing authority. When you have the subsidy from your public housing authority, that means every single month the tenant can pay $236, but then the housing authority is going to cover the next $864 of the rent. Just using that in my head. So that's why every single month, even if the resident does not pay the rent of $236, I will still get $864 from the government every single month, which is the advantage of affordable housing, right? So even as a resident decides not to pay, I know I'm still getting a certain portion from the government every single month. Hence why some folks refer it to as a recession-resistant investment asset class. So that's what I wanted to go through with you guys today. So what did we talk about? We did the same process that we typically did, looking at affordablehousing.com, looking at HUD FMR. We didn't go through the rehab estimate line item by line item because I was provided that estimate already by a contractor. And then afterwards, you guys saw how we went through all the different scenarios for this property. So we did the same thing where we went through our creative finance calculator, went through all the scenarios, adjusting the asking price. I doubled our renovation estimate, but everything that you've seen, we have been doing on our own over the last 50 days. The only thing I was doing was adjusting the purchase price, adjusting the down payment, and then adjusting the interest rate on the seller finance term. And when we did that, that's how we arrived at all different scenarios that we went through so that we can determine what the LOI was and what options can we present to the seller that still meets what the seller is looking for from a higher purchase price. I was willing to give them a higher purchase price if we got a more favorable term on like a principal only payment. And I presented to the seller, and the seller chose option one. So that's how we decided to do it. And then ultimately what you saw was LOI that was submitted, and ultimately we closed on a property. And this is how you saw what a seller financing looks like on a HUD statement. And then you saw, I think I had a picture of the wheelchair ramp. So you can kind of see like, hey, this is the wheelchair ramp that we put in place to make the residents' quality of life better. So when we put this in, you can see that this was completed in June. We did not get this rental increase until November. So when you are underwriting your deals, please make sure that you guys are setting aside holding costs, because you will not get your rental increase right away. Sometimes you might have to wait until the next lease renewal if a tenant's already in place. So these are all considerations for you to kind of take a look at and see whether or not this is an area that you want to invest in. And for me, it made a lot of sense because even though this is probably like a Class C neighborhood, because a resident was already living there, you have a slightly lower risk, not zero risk, of people breaking into the home if the home's already occupied, right? And in this area in Birmingham, it's very street by street, so it's very wise for you to do a street view or Google drive-by on the neighborhood to see whether or not you're noticing any weird things. When I did the Google drive-by, like I didn't see any big red flags there. So let's see if we can kind of go through this again to see if it's been updated. Yeah, this street looks fine. Like it was just looking like a regular neighborhood, to be quite honest with you. Yeah, it's just like a regular neighborhood. Like nothing like extraordinary out of there. There's a dead end over there. Just small little homes. So even though that the crime stat was about 126, I believe, when I looked up the address on Top App, it wasn't like a really, really bad area. And plus there was a resident already occupied. So I didn't see that much risk, but then I also saw some upside with a rental increase that we can potentially get to, especially if we got to $1,000 in rent here. Let's see. Yeah, once you get to $1,000 in rent, it gets a little bit more attractive. And then if we got to the full 1150, which was our best case scenario, that was the 17% that we were looking for. So awesome. This was a good Tuesday. Hopefully this was helpful for you guys can understand like what the thought process was for what we thought was a deal. I would say I'm probably better at underwriting now versus what I was doing about 6 months ago. So slowly you can see me making improvements, and you can see why it's so important to go through all these different scenarios so you can figure out what terms you can offer to your seller, so that you're not just offering them like, hey, I can give you seller financing, blah, blah, blah. You're giving them options to see what works best for them. And in this scenario, the seller picked this option probably because the monthly payment was the highest out of all of the different options, even though other options might have had a higher purchase price. Cool. All right. Awesome. This was fun. If you guys have any questions, please make sure you DM me. If you guys have any sort of rental properties already, I would appreciate you guys can support the podcast by using the referral link in the show notes to get a free insurance quote from Steadily. If you guys do ever get insurance quote, just make sure you guys are comparing apples to apples, meaning coverage limits, liability limits, property damage limits, all that stuff. You got to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples, because every insurance policy is different. Not an insurance agent. Again, I'm not soliciting any investments here. I'm simply showing you guys what I do on a daily basis. In this scenario, I'm just showing you guys why we decided to purchase the property for that certain purchase price and why did we agree on those terms. You can kind of see it's nothing different than what we've been doing for the last 50 days. I knew one of our viewers asked for a example of a deal that I purchased in the past. Well, this is a good example of why we decided to do it. We saw that, hey, we can or achieve 17% on our estimated rent, but then we can still achieve a minimum bare return of whatever percentage that you might decide. This is not investment advice, but just showing you guys what I'm doing every single day. I'm going to keep doing this for the next 50 days. This is like the 52nd day. So having a lot of fun. And I hope you guys are just, again, if you guys are having issues raising capital, just copy what I'm doing. Look at the same properties, using the same spreadsheet every single day. And I think you will create an undeniable track history in your own YouTube channel. So you guys can ultimately raise capital, reduce the fear in your life, and prove to yourself, most importantly, that you know what you're doing. When you can show yourself that you have analyzed a deal for 100 days in a row, that's when you can get a lot of the confidence to decide and pull the trigger. Because honestly, at the end of the day, you can analyze as much as you want, but you got to figure out when you're going to pull the trigger. And for me, when I underwrote so many different properties every single day, finally I see some numbers. I'm like, oh, okay, this is a deal. I'm willing to move forward with this. Because in every deal, technically, there should be a number that makes sense or terms that make it make sense. So that's how we went through all those different scenarios. You saw in the spreadsheet earlier, we went through 20 scenarios. Does it take time? Yeah, it does take time. But then you mess around with it and eventually you figure out, hey, what are all the different levers that I can pull to make this a deal? You don't necessarily have to just buy on the market property using a 25% down payment, using 8.5% interest rate. There's a number of terms that work for every single deal. So hopefully this was helpful, guys. If you guys want a copy of the spreadsheet, I've been very fortunate enough to have been given this spreadsheet for other folks, by other folks, and I was able to update it and analyze it so that it meets my criteria. I'm not saying it's the best spreadsheet. I'm also not claiming to be an expert in affordable housing. I just love it. And I'm so thankful that all of you guys are watching. All of you guys care about affordable housing. I'm so grateful and so blessed. I'm so passionate about this stuff. So thank you for what you guys do. If there weren't people like you guys that cared about giving back and helping others through housing, I would have never had the home I grew up in. So thank you so much. This is how I want to pay it forward. And have an amazing day. For those of you that I might not see for the rest of this week, have a happy Thanksgiving with all your family members. I will still be live every single day. So I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. We just launched on Spotify, so would really appreciate you guys can look up affordable housing real estate investing on Spotify and leave us a 5-star review. Thank you so much, guys. Have an amazing, amazing day. Talk to you guys soon. Talk to you guys tomorrow.